Welcome. This is Uncommon Sense, a CPA podcast presented by the Heshe CPA Knowledge Center. The center is an initiative of the CPA Education Foundation, the charitable arm of the chartered professional accountant profession in Alberta. For the record, this CPA podcast isn't about bean counting. Our episodes feature conversations with Alberta CPAs sharing their insights on a wide range of timely topics.
Well, hello and welcome back. Welcome to this episode of Uncommon Sense. I'm Gord Beal, Senior Vice President at CPA Alberta, and your host for part 2 of our conversation with Janice Anderson, CPA and CA. If you haven't already listened to part 1 of this two-parter with Janice, I recommend that you do so. We covered a lot of interesting ground and worthwhile to hear some of the insights Janice shared during that episode. As you will have learned in part 1, Janice Anderson is a national leader in the area of sustainability at the corporate level. She currently serves as Senior Director, Technical Accounting and ESG Compliance at Nutrien Limited. Here, she is at the intersection of financial and sustainability reporting. Now, as a board member of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, Janice leverages her expertise to advance the adoption of sustainability disclosure standards in Canada. Janice's contributions to accounting and sustainability resulted in her receiving CPA Alberta's Distinguished Accomplishment Award for 2024. I think she was one of the inaugural members of the board, in fact, of the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, so we'll be able to hear this episode, a little bit of her experiences with that board. So in this second part of our two-parter, we'll continue our discussion about Janice's work and experience as a CPA, who also, as I say, happens to be one of Canada's foremost experts in sustainability reporting in business. It's been an interesting ride for you, Janice.
I was like, that was a very long introduction. I have to say thank you, everyone, for listening to part 2. I'm glad we kept everyone enough intrigued that they want to listen to the second part. So it's a pleasure to be here again. Thank you for having me.
No, it's delightful to be able to talk to you. I really appreciate you coming back for a part 2. My challenge, of course, is I could probably talk to you all day about some of these topics, and so our wanting to make sure that we cover the areas that hopefully will be interesting for the audience. And one thing we didn't talk much about during the first episode, although we got some really great insight about, around business and the responsibilities of business, and of course your role at Nutrien. I wanted to turn now to your role and your work on the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, or the CSSB as the acronym is often referred to. I understand that you were at really one of the first members of this body, and congratulations on that accomplishment. Can you tell us what the body is and who
are we? Why are we here?
Exactly.
Great question. So we were formed by this implementation review committee, and this, what happened, there was this need to review how we set standards in Canada. And so we have this implementation review committee, and I'll give a brief lesson. We had 3 boards in Canada. We had the Accounting Standards Board, and they are the ones that mandate public companies to do IFRS along with Canadian securities regulators. It's a dual role there, but they're the ones who also set the accounting standards that private entities use. We call that ASPE. They also set nonprofit and pension fund accounting standards in Canada. So we already have a board that does the accounting standards, and they leverage the work. So for public entities, we talked about this in the first episode, public entities were mandated to adopt IFRS as issued by the International Board. We made that move in the 2010-2011 timeframe. We have a second board, the Audit and Assurance Standards Board, and they are the ones that set the assurance standards. And we also made that same switch back in the 2009-2010 to move to the international standards for assurance. And then the Canadian Assurance Standards Boards brings those to Canada. You're going to start to see a trend here. Mm-hmm. And then we also have the Public Sector Accounting Board, but that's very specific to the public sector for Canada, and I believe that's mostly government. So we had these 3 boards, and each of those boards have an oversight committee. But the task of the implementation review committee said, okay, well, is that standard setting function working effectively for Canada? Is it serving the Canadian public interest? But at the same time, this is when the ISSB, this International Sustainability Standards Board, was formed. And I will remind everyone that the International Sustainability Standards Board is the sister board of the International Accounting Standards Board. They're both mandated and governed by the IFRS trustees. And so this ISSB was formed by the IFRS trustees because the environment for sustainability reporting was very fragmented in terms of all these voluntary standards. And so everyone said, wouldn't it be nice to have one global set of standards?
Referred to as the alphabet soup of
the
reporting.
alphabet soup. Now, and wouldn't it be nice to have one organization to set sustainability standards? And who should do that? And of course, the IFRS, the people who set IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standards, said, why don't we do it similar to accounting standards? We already have really good uptake on the international reporting front. I think we could really find a lot of synergies and due processes there. So the implementation review, bringing it back to your question, was set up, and they're like, wouldn't it be great if this International Sustainability Standards Board is being developed? We should probably have an equivalent Canadian Sustainability Standards Board to help bring those standards to Canada. And thus, the CSSB was formed to really support that effort. But we are an independent board. We're made up of board members from across Canada, and we also did get to set our mandate, and we said, okay, well, this implementation committee set us up, but as a board, we had to say to ourselves, what is our mandate? And we confirmed, our mandate is to set Canadian sustainability disclosure standards in Canada. And so we are going to base them off of the ISSB, but we do have a criteria for modification framework. And so that's what you saw with our consultation. So we looked at the standard. We said they are fit for purpose in Canada, but we now need to consult on those standards. Is there any Canadian-specific modifications that we need to bring to help bring these standards to Canada? We believe in a global baseline, but should we? And so what we did as a board was we worked very hard. We started as a board in July 2023, and then we got these standards out for consultation, and we asked very specific targeted questions. The consultation was March. It ended in June. And then we've now been going through all of our processes to see, okay, what modifications, if any, do we need to make? I will say we made a public commitment to have these standards out by the end of the year. And I truly believe we can make that time frame because I have been working so hard behind the scenes to get this done. So I'm really proud of the work that we've accomplished. But that's probably the story. I'm a big storyteller of why we have a CSSB set up to help, like the other four boards. And our goal is to do this, but then the next question, if you're going to ask me, is how does this translate to securities law and mandatory reporting?
Yeah, that's something that for as long as really I've been in this space, it's been voluntary reporting. There really hasn't been much in the way of requirements. I really appreciate your reference to how the CSSB was established. I'm also I know there's a dedicated group of staff at CPA Canada who support the whole standard setting process. Really important, all the work that goes into all of that. And then I also think about, from a regulatory point of view, when it starts to actually become more on the mandatory side of things. Are we going through that transition now? And can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I get to really lean into I worked at the Alberta Securities Commission for 5 years. I have deep connections with all the securities regulators, and there is such a great relationship with the CSA and CSSB staff. So what I'll say is, what happened in Canada is the CSA was actually one of the first regulators that said we need to mandate climate. And their rule came out in November 2021. So if anyone's doing a timeline, November 2021 is when they issued their first proposed rule on mandating climate. The SEC went out with their rule March 2022. ISSB wasn't, the International Sustainability Standards Board wasn't even formed until that time. I think it was November 2022 when they were formed. So the CSA was the first one that said, hey, we want to mandate climate. Now, underpinning all of these rules on climate, at least, is this voluntary framework called the it's TCFD. What does it stand for? Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures.
Yeah.
TCFD. So
Yes.
everyone... And the ISSB standards brought them in, so everyone's already kind of on this general baseline about what those standards are requiring.
A lot of work went into the TCFD.
A lot of work went in. It was led by Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg, and it had a big backing. And they really did try.
That was important. They had a lot of stakeholders supporting that.
Supporting it.
And there was a lot of outreach. Yeah.
And I'm sure I can share this maybe I should, but when I was at the Alberta Securities Commission, I believe it was 2015 when we first saw the TCFD and they came knocking on our door and they're like, hey guys, do you want to adopt these? We're like, it's okay, we're fine. Like, that wasn't where the role of the securities regulators were going and mandating climate. We already had our other rules. And in fact, the CSA has its own, they've been looking at climate risk disclosure since 2010 was the first staff notice. And
so back in the day when I was at CPA Canada, there was we also facilitated quite a bit of outreach across the country to support the work of TCFD.
That's probably where we met.
Really, yeah, if I recall some of that, and it's I think that's such an important part of the standard setting process is that outreach and that engaging different stakeholders, getting different perspectives.
And that's actually maybe probably why these standards, then the ISSB released their international standards so quickly on climate. And we have the first topical theme called climate. And it's because it's actually been based on all of this work that everyone has been doing and focusing on since mid-2000s when the TCFD was formed. And that's been kind of where everyone's been leading. So when the CSA issued their first proposal in November 2021, pretty much mandating TCFD-like disclosures. What's your governance? What's your strategy? What's your risk management on climate? Hey, can you also disclose your metrics of GHG emissions, our Scope 1?
That's a really nice summary of TCFD. What
that's very straightforward. And that's essentially what our disclosure standards are. Yeah. And so, and then the CSA watched the ISSB, the SEC, and I'm sorry for all the acronyms, they watched all of a sudden this emergence of these international standard settings. So what the CSA has done has been very patient and waiting. And I think they said, investors are demanding this information. We want to get a rule out there for climate to start regulating it. However, we kind of want to support this global baseline. So they have been very public in their support for the work of the CSSB. They have been saying they want to adopt it on a climate first basis. So that's going to be interesting on how we work through that because they are sustainability standards. So I think we're looking forward to the next step, get out our standards because now this is my securities regulator, former securities regulator hat on to say they can't write a rule if they don't know what the standards are yet. It's hard. You can't just make things up. So we need to do our final work on get a rule out, and then it goes over to them. And they have some tough questions ahead of them because while we will have the base framework, they have to still know what entities, what form is this going to be at? What's the governance going to be behind it that they are going to regulate? And then do they want to take every single piece of our standards or not? It's not the same handshake deal that we have with IFRS where you have to adopt it. We're at the forefront of this. So I think we're still going to be on a path to mandatory disclosures of climate, at least climate first. But it's going to be challenging. But, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And Gord, I would love to, what's going to happen in 10 years? Can we come back in 10 years and say, man, what a wild ride all of this was to get this in place in Canada?
Well, I think it's funny that you say that because about 10 years ago, we put together a sustainability advisory board during my tenure at CPA Canada. And I remember one of the individuals leaned over to me, wouldn't it be amazing if one day there was actually a sustainability standards board like the ACSB, like the Accounting Standards Board?
Oh my goodness.
And I still remember that. And so I get a bit of tingles when you say that.
I know I'm on it.
We're really geeking out, aren't we?
I know. I was like, I love it. And it's been so challenging and hard because the board is comprised of so many different humans. So unlike, it's not done by one profession. Yeah. So we have investors on our board. We have people in the banking industry. We have the oil and gas. I represent agriculture in Western Canada and accounting. And then we have scientists and engineers. And we're all trying to come together to write standards. And I think one of the first meetings, I'm like, okay, let's talk about the handbook. And everyone's like, what's a handbook? I'm like, oh God, this is the level that we're talking about. Yeah. And so we had to get to, what is a handbook? It's common language for accountants, but it wasn't for this board. True. So it's been such a ride, learning from those humans and then me contributing my accounting knowledge to get sustainability disclosure standards.
Yeah. Accounting, regulatory background. Practical business experience.
Hey, we really need to understand the views of the CSA and OSFI. OSFI is for the banking industry, so the CSA will cover public, OSFI. And then we just had the government.
Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions.
Thank you. See, I use these acronyms.
I don't know where that came from.
I don't even know. sometimes I even forget. I'm like, can someone just Google that? Can we have show notes or something? And then Canada, the government of Canada just announced that they're looking at changing the Canadian Business Corporations Act to mandate climate-related disclosures, at least for federal. And so we're really hoping that our
lots of things pointing
standards
towards
are going to be pointing to our
requirement.
standards.
Yeah, absolutely. The standards are so important. The standard setting process, and I'm going to geek out a little bit longer here for just a moment, because there's historically, because I've obviously been part of the profession, been involved also with the IFRS transition, the auditing standards transition, there's this tension between getting it to market as quickly as possible and making sure that it's market ready, while at the same time the due diligence of engaging various stakeholders, going through the process and making sure that you don't put something out there that could lead to, let's say, inappropriate results.
Yeah, unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences.
So that's been huge. And Gord, we received 170 comment letters.
Wow.
So guess what I spent my summer doing? Like I read, and our board met, we read every single comment letter from every single human. We participated in webinars. We got staff summaries when they did webinars about what everyone said. And then the staff worked so hard, and I have to give my gratitude to the staff for even taking that information, distilling it. We had multiple board members discussing all of it to make sure, then how do we take that feedback for the standards? I'm extremely proud of what we're going to deliver to the market. So maybe, touch base with me in the new year, and we'll have another chat about those.
Maybe plan for another podcast.
But it was a lot. And now we're going to shift to how do we get people to adopt it? Because right now it's going to be voluntary. I have the view that if you're already doing sustainability reporting, particularly in this environmental bill C-59, perhaps you want to use a framework, and perhaps you want to use our framework, because we're leveraging the International Sustainability Standards Board. So I think our standards are really fit for purpose for Canadian companies to disclose sustainability-related risks and opportunities. But we got a lot of feedback in that process.
Yeah, that's great. It's really interesting to hear. And it sounds like there's been a lot of engagement, which is so critical to the establishment of appropriate standards in this context. You've alluded to it a number of times, and I'm going to ask the intersection with the International Sustainability Standards Board. And I raise that because I think it was really interesting how you were referring to the Accounting Standards Board, the Auditing Standards Board, and now, of course, the Sustainability Standards Board. And, I'm familiar that staff who support those boards work really hard, and it's to do the necessary research to support the board, and there's can I say it almost like a two-way process. So yes, part of it is how do we adopt those international standards, but historically, I think in the accounting standards, the auditing standards, and I'm thinking also on the sustainability standards, Canada has actually played a pretty significant role in influencing some of these things. And some people would argue maybe even punched above our weight a little bit.
100%.
Can you comment on that?
Well, I mean, even if you look at the international board, we have Linda Maison-Hutter, who's the vice chair of the International Accounting Standards Board. And she used to chair the Canadian Audit and Standards Board. So we do have a deep history of contributing. And maybe that's even my passion. If you go back to episode 1, how I even got involved in this, my comment letter writing process, because I have a deep love for this stuff, and Canada has this. So we have a couple things, like we brought the ISSB, they are located in Montreal, like their head office is in Canada. Yeah. Now, we already had these climate standards. Those standards actually predated the ISSB board members. They were developed only when they had the two board members. They had the original Sue Lloyd and Emmanuel Faber. They were the ones who really stewarded those standards. But now you have a full operating board of ISSB, you have full staff. And so how we're contributing in Canada is we're starting to contribute to their expertise. And they have some research projects. Their next focus is going to be on biodiversity. And so that's where our next focus is as the Canadian board. How do we contribute to that research? How do we contribute our views? And we actually have a seat on the ISSB they have their global sustainability, like they have their I can't remember what that acronym is going to be, but they have their group of countries that get together to help contribute to the standards, and Canada has a seat at the table there. So we are deeply connected with the ISSB. We meet regularly with them, and we hope to continue to strengthen that relationship.
Oh, those are great thoughts to share. Thank you for that. I have heard over the years people question, well, why do we have Canadian boards when there's an international board? And it's just Canada's a unique country. We may not represent a large proportion of the world's capital markets, but in that context, to represent the uniqueness of the Canadian environment, the Canadian capital markets, and Canadian business. That's where I would imagine the Canadian boards really can make a big difference and have made a big difference in terms of influencing how those international standards get rolled out.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And because, we are a big country with a lot of resources. And I mean, you could argue that every country in the world is impacted by sustainability matters, but we need to care deeply about what the standards are going to be so they're not going to have unintended consequences. So we need to, and that's part of the role that I play because I can see the matters that matter most to Nutrien, and then I can bring them to the international board to help shape the standards before they're even written, because you will see them through the Canadian board, because once the ISSB writes a new standard, then we'll expose it for adoption to make sure it's fit for purpose. But it's going to be difficult to modify standards at that time. We have a very strict criteria for modification. So we need to be at the forefront of the ISSB standard setting. And that's the role we also play, is to make sure that the new standards that will come out are fit for Canadian purpose before they even get rolled out.
Wow. Well, I will say thank you to you and other members of the board for making sure that Canadian voice is heard, and for the contributions in this, the work that you're doing. So we're going to take a little bit of we've talked a lot about the standard side of things, and a couple of issues that have always been near and dear to my heart in the context of accounting. This issue of transparency, accountability. It strikes me that these are issues that are really coming to the forefront in this whole sustainability space. And I wonder, can you just talk briefly about, what does transparency even mean in this work?
I think it's huge, but I think I'm going to take it in the lens that, if we go back to where we were maybe a couple of years ago in sustainability reporting, but also a lot of big initiatives and this whole 2030, these 2030 goals, Paris Accords, we have these COPs, and you're saying companies or countries make these commitments. And we're like, yeah, we're going to do those. And this whole concept of net zero came up, and everyone's like, oh, that's great. But then I think the world has started to realize that there's a lot of challenges that come with making those commitments and making those actually come to reality. And then some people will say, well, those were just very ambitious targets. I'm like, all right, well, you still put those out there. I always use my securities regulatory accounting hat and lens, and I actually pull on a lot of things. It's this base things that we learn from accounting 101 and report writing. It's this concept of ethical report writing. When we write things, we need to make sure that they're accurate, verified, complete. We've considered the management judgment and the biases in those sentences. But when you pull this into sustainability reporting and transparency, where we're getting at is, are those commitments that you may have made as a company, are they actually going to come to fruition? And do you have a reasonable expectation of meeting those? And so I see this movement happening, and you can see it from the Canadian Securities Administrators. I will point out they issued a staff notice back November 2022. It's 51364 if someone wants to Google that. It's on page 15. This is my mind. This is why I'm a good technical accountant.
Yeah, that's great.
And they were the first ones who really came out in Canada to talk about greenwashing.
Yeah.
And they gave some really great examples about what statements companies are making and how that could be seen as overly promotional and greenwashing. And so in the same lens about transparency, I think it's a moment that everyone's saying, well, do you have a reasonable basis of making those commitments? It's an actual securities law if you're a public company. And that's the movement that we're starting to see, is investors and other stakeholders are demanding more transparency, because I think there's a lack of belief that you might meet all of these things that you might have promised in the world.
Don't just share the good.
Don't just share the good. And are you going to meet it? So I think what you're seeing in Bill C-59, I've talked about that a couple times, but they're all just trying to say is make sure what you're reporting is transparent. And I believe transparency is complete, accurate, reliable, that your commitments have capital behind them, that you're actually going to do them. And if you're not, then be transparent about why not and the changes that you need to make as a company. Yeah,
that's a really excellent point. If I can pick on that for just a moment, because greenwashing has been a topic out there for some time. And, I think it's a bit controversial. There's people who are calling for businesses to do more, to demonstrate that they're actually making a difference. And so challenges that are out there from stakeholders, perhaps investors. But, I think there's a possible tension there that exists, is that, greenwashing, if a company is being too aspirational, that could undermine what you've been describing as sort of that perhaps really being honest with it. Can you comment a little bit about that? Because it must put some corporations in a difficult spot. I mean, they may want to demonstrate that they're trying to make a difference, and yet at the same time, they may be facing challenges when it comes to that concept of greenwashing. And hey, wait a second, you're not holding up to the bargain. You're not holding up to what your commitments were.
Yeah, so I think as a company, you need to balance expectations. And so you can see all of these pressures, and there might be this big driver to say, hey, you need to do X, Y, and Z. But then as a company, you have to go, okay, is this what your investors and your investors are also demanding? Because that is the world we live in today, where investors invest in public. I'm talking from the public company perspective. Investors are investing their good dollars into companies, and then our companies, we have to create value from those to be a sustainable company, to operate in the long term. And so I believe the decisions that you need to make as an organization with your commitments, your sustainability commitments, need to also be in line with where your investors expect to spend those dollars. And so I actually think this is a great time to really look at what your investors want you to do as a company. And either are you going to mitigate regulation risk, or you're mitigating risk of maybe having the social license to operate by doing these things. And what can you do as a company that maintains all of it? And I think as a company, if you can make that story, here's why I'm spending this capital, here's where I'm spending this time and resources because of this to investors, and you have investor buy-in, then that's aligned. But the worst part is when you don't have alignment between what your investors want and the broader society, that's not going to make yourself a sustainable company. Yeah. So I think it's a precarious balance, and you're right, there's a tension there. And this is where a lot of stakeholder engagement needs to come into play.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess it's finding the right balance, but it is, it's important for organizations to have meaningful goals and meaningful commitment. And that ties for me then the other word that we've alluded to a couple of times around accountability. What you're effectively say what you're going to do, and then show whether or not you've accomplished it, and demonstrate what you might be doing to adjust accordingly.
And use from a reporting, and if CPAs are listening to this to take away something for their own company, it's things I speak about. Go read over your documents, and what language are you using? Are you using these fun words because they're just great to use? Like eco-friendly and sustainable operation. Like, what does that mean? And it's just making sure that when you use these words, you have clear definitions, you can support it. Oh, we met all of this. And then otherwise, it's just being more precise in the language that you use. And that can help mitigate the risk of greenwashing because you're just being more precise. So it's just stopping using those fluffy words will really help you in this, because you're worried about the misconceptions out there. You're like, oh, we're a green company. You're like, I don't even know what that means. You painted your vehicles green, or you're actually doing all of this capital. Here's the projects that you're doing. But I think right now, because we don't have a definition of what it means to be sustainable, I think it's very difficult to use those words now to say, just when you're talking broadly about your company, we are a sustainable company. It's like, well, what does that even mean? So it's just being precise what you mean, so you're not misconstruing anybody, I think will be the most successful tool in your toolkit you can do while you're thinking about reporting.
Well, it's no wonder to me why you're being seen as an expert in this field. You've drawn on all of your experiences as a CPA from your regulatory background, probably even dating back to your audit years. And, and not everybody has all those skills, but I think there is, you've alluded to these CPA skills and experiences and how they've helped you in this field. And I wonder if more generally, like, what role or roles do you think the CPA profession as a whole can play when it comes to sustainability? And are there some specific areas that are, you've already alluded to some of that, but I just wonder if you could just recap a few things for me.
Yeah, and maybe it's just starting the journey with what my team did when we just started looking at it. It was like, okay, well, for what are we up against? Like, do you have a sustainability report? Do you have sustainability disclosures, and read it over? Do you understand it? Is it decision useful information out there? And then you can start asking questions. It's like, well, how did you write that information? What controls did you have? Who approves? Who reviews? Where's the data coming from? And I think that's the role finance can, because then you can listen in and see, okay, maybe there's some gaps, or can we support in these areas? So we started by building out SOX-like controls. We went to our manufacturing sites, and we started to actually document all the controls for our Scope 1 and Scope 2 GHG emissions. And through that's how I learned along the way. I was like, I don't even know what a GHG, someone tell me what an emission is. And so I started asking questions. I started learning from our engineers, how do you calculate it? Oh, we purchase natural gas and we combust it. Makes sense. How do you get that information? And they're like, well, we use our invoices. And then we look at our meters to calibrate it. I'm like, sorry, you use your invoices? Oh, maybe Is there someone looking at the
That's
invoices to record it for emissions and accounting's paying that invoice and perhaps there's synergies there? I have a seeking suspicion. So I just started asking questions about, how do we build controls? Why are we writing? Are we going to meet our commitments? What's the capital? How we can support this disclosure initiative? And I think that's really led me to success. So it's just really being curious, asking questions to understand, and then it just kind of pops out at you. And maybe I'll give the one antidote because I think we've talked about this before. But when I learned about the invoice factor and timeliness of reporting, so timely. I'm going to take a little bit of a thread here, but timeliness of reporting is actually a big piece with these new sustainability standards. They say, okay, if you're doing financial statements, you should be really doing your sustainability reporting at the same time. So I sent to an engineer. I was like, is that going to be a problem? He goes, Janice, we cannot possibly issue our sustainability report at the same time as our financial statements. I'm like, hey, why? And I just like saying, why? Like my children. Why, Mom? And he goes, well, we use a lot of the information in December and we get those invoices at the end of January. So we don't get the invoices till the end of January. So we can't possibly record our emissions before that date. And I was like, everyone hopefully is having the light bulb. Oh, we have this concept called an accrual. We can make estimates. And so we started to change the processes behind the scenes to build in these estimation processes, making sure it's still decision useful. There's checks and controls to make sure the December estimate actually came to fruition, but it's actually sped up our reporting. And so I'm giving you these specific examples because that's how I used all my accounting knowledge, and it blew the engineers' minds because engineers, I think, now not to make fun of all the engineers on here, but they're very precise. Like they've gone to a level of precision. If you don't do your calculations properly, a gas plant will blow up. Whereas accounting, we're like, I really don't care about decimal. Stop showing. I don't even want to see a decimal place. Like, can you just round to the nearest millionth? So it's actually like sharing that knowledge with your engineering folks or the data providers. Be like, you can use estimates. You can streamline and make it faster. And you don't have to get to this umpteenth level of precision. You just need a number that's decision useful. Yeah. So hopefully through those stories, I've shared a little bit about how accountants can actually help build sustainability reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you sharing those stories and sharing those insights. When I think about some of the conversations I've had with some accountants and some non-accountants talking about how we need to stick to our knitting and let's focus on what we're good at. And I'm thinking, well, actually, this is what we're good at.
This is what we're good at.
We can bring it. But you've alluded to other experts or other professions. And I know when I went through the accounting program, it was very important. It was hammered into us. Know what we know and know what we don't know, and know when to involve other experts. And I suspect in the sustainability realm, that's going to be necessary.
Absolutely. I have made friends with our engineers. Legal is a big part of this. I work hand in hand with our legal group, and I think we're both the no office. Like, we can't disclose that, no. Our sustainability folks, the ones who are coming up with the strategies and actually making differences. So we really have to lean on each other. This is probably the most cross-functional team, and I think we're even going to see that from a governance perspective. We've been having conversations, even who should be approving these? How is the audit committee involved? Or do you have a separate governance? How is the board involved in this? Because I think it's going to take everybody with different skill sets to come together to make this reporting and actually, be successful in these initiatives.
Those are great thoughts. So I'm going to we're getting towards the end of this second episode again. So unfortunately, we're going to have to start wrapping it up soon. But I am curious. It sounds to me like you took on a lot of this yourself. I mean, you clearly, you dove in, you read things, you learned a lot through the process. Do you think that the current education and training of what you know of it, for CPAs, both new but also existing, are we keeping pace with some of the expectations that are now emerging for CPAs to be involved with this work?
Right. A huge shout out to my team. I should be very clear. I am not a team of one. I had two, and now I have one right now, and we're just working on rebuilding our team right now. I have a team of very competent individuals. Shout out, and we've been learning together. Has been wonderful, and so first off, I think when we started, there wasn't a lot of educational materials, but we used our minds. We read the standards. I read the GHG protocol. I read the ISSB standards. I tried to learn and understand the words behind it. What is an emission? And I started talking to people and have the curiosity. And now we're starting to see more programs available. So CPA Canada has their inaugural sustainability program training, and actually, I think that was done by a lot. I know some of the folks who helped write it, and we piloted it. A number of Nutrien staff helped pilot that project. We gave feedback. I think it's a wonderful course that CPA Canada is offering to learn and get crash courses in this. And I also took, there's this other organization called Competent Boards. So I wanted to kind of get this board executive perspective from sustainability so I could help steward those conversations. Yeah. So I took that designation and I did that last year. I did that last year.
That's another topic we could probably spend some time on.
I know, I have my GCB.D. It's another
well
designation
done.
that I got on.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of learnings that's customizable. So I highly recommend the CPA Canada course now. They did a good job bringing everything together and the practicalities. And the team who took the program, they're like, oh, it wasn't a joke. I really had to try it, that course, but then they got the learning and they got that knowledge. So I do think the profession's starting to give training available for CPAs so everyone can be, up to speed with these initiatives.
Yeah, and I suspect the reality is many CPAs will have to get education from a variety of sources to get themselves up to speed, including, as you've alluded to, doing it themselves in terms of reading standards and diving into
pretty
it.
Short.
And yeah, they're actually, I hate to say it, but I find them there's a lot of really interesting elements to it. I mean, as a non-standards person who finds it quite interesting to even read those. Do you think the post-secondary schools are they ready for this? Are they doing enough to help create those students who are ultimately, and they may not all be CPAs coming out of business programs, et cetera, but are you seeing or hearing that our post-secondary is addressing this issue?
I think they definitely know it's an issue. I spoke at the CPA Alberta Education Foundation. We did that together this summer. I think that was. I can't even remember when that was. And I've started to be involved. And I know we've contributed to. I know they're doing some research on it, and we've contributed to some of that research to say how should they start tailoring these programs. I think, though, the base knowledge you're getting out of the business school and accounting particularly, what are we teaching? We're teaching how to audit things. We're teaching how to count things. These are the same things that we're doing in the sustainability feature. We're just not counting dollars, money, monetary items. We're counting non-financial things. So I do actually think the curriculum can be a tweak to bring some of the more relevant sustainability aspects and teach the additional things you might need to know, like what is the frameworks out there, what are risks and opportunities. So lean into a little bit more risk. What are risks? How do you manage risks? That piece of the curriculum, and we've definitely given that feedback, but I do think the universities are really set up for success in the accounting field in particular here.
That's great to hear. Yeah, and it just feels from our conversation that there's just a lot happening. I mean, the world is changing right before our eyes. We're living in historic times, and we're seeing how the profession has to adapt, schools, education has to adapt, individual CPAs have to adapt, businesses are adapting. So, I mean, it's an interesting time, isn't it?
It is. And actually, so that's funny. So when we started the ESG compliance team within finance, it was me and another individual. And then we brought on a second individual to help with our initiatives. And I did say when they joined my team, I was like, you're going to learn a lot. And you're also going to see a lot of stuff that's going on in the world. Like sometimes we're not always thinking about climate change or what companies are doing and how things are meeting a commitment. So I'm like, you're going to be inundated with this stuff, and don't get disheartened. Just remember there's a lot of good things in the world, and here's how we can make changes. But when you're constantly inundated, when you start to get into this field about the aspects of climate change, but just know that here's the part that we can play, and to not get overwhelmed with those things. Take it a step at a time, and just to start like biting off those little pieces. Don't try to boil the ocean. I guess that's probably not a joke anymore. But just starting small, like what can we do? How can you help out? So if you're saying, how can finance put up their hand and start with sustainability? It's just even starts with reading your reports and having a conversation with a couple people and then starting to find gaps. Here's how you can play a role in, but not trying to get to where you think you should be in 5 years. Just start small in these things.
Oh, that's great advice. And, I think I probably know the answer to this. I'm just going to ask you one sort of last little question. It's maybe a loaded one, but I think I can read between the lines listening to you, but are you optimistic about the future? Are we going to be ready? Are businesses going to be well prepared? Are CPAs going to continue to play a big role? What is that future state like? I know you're not a fortune teller, but what do you see down the road?
What do I see? I see that sustainability was a big topic of conversation and what companies should be doing towards climate change. But I think the environment has shifted. The pendulum has swung a little bit. And I think there's just some more pressing issues that we're seeing in Canada And so if I look at what does the general person in Canada care about? 5 years ago, climate change probably would have been top of mind. Right now, it's housing affordability. It's the cost of prices, it's inflation, it's food security. They're not just climate sustainability issues right now. There's some
so much more.
deep issues that everyone's facing right now. So I kind of keep that in mind when companies are looking at allocating capital and doing initiatives, and this costs a lot. We have a lot of turmoil in the government. We just had some recent announcements from, capping Alberta. Like there's lots of stuff going on. So I take a step back and say, I think everyone needs to really have a pragmatic approach about what they can and can't do. But then I also think we have to say, like, the world might not set out to meet the target of this 1.5 Paris Accord. And so my very personal belief is we also have to start planning a little bit more to help transition to prepare for climate physical risks. And okay, there's more fires, there's more floods, and this isn't, it may not be at the company, this is actually probably more of a government level. How are we going to start to think about climate change to protect our economy? And so I'm probably more of a pessimist, but I'm probably a realist. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I just see the pendulum has swung, and capital is not being allocated on a worldwide basis to fix some of these things. I read the IEA reports, and that's the International, I don't even know what the IEA stands for, but they're issuing reports about where they think on the transition. And so it's a bit dire on some of the stuff. So I just think as long as we're thinking about it and preparing, that's probably where I'll leave that.
No, actually, those are excellent comments and maybe a good place to stop. I think you're
it's a very negative place to stop.
No, I don't think so. I think, being pragmatic and being realistic there, and being careful not to try to bite off more than we can chew in some ways. I mean, really realizing that, yes, the issues are big, sometimes so big that it can be a bit scary. But, I think what you've demonstrated time and time in your career is what we can all take away in terms of how we're going to deal with this, which is take it one step at a time. Yeah. Learn, be curious, and don't shy away from the challenges that are presented, because every one of us on an individual basis can make a difference. And there's no doubt in my mind, Janice, that the work you're doing, you're making a difference. And it's been really fabulous to talk. I wish we could go on longer. I do hope that maybe you'll allow me to possibly invite you back for another podcast down the road. But I really thank you for everything you shared with us over these last couple of episodes. And this episode, again, certainly it's only beginnings for many people. Yes. There's a lot more ahead, but for your insights, your perspectives, and I will say that you have an optimism about, we can do this.
Yes.
And I want to thank you for you taking the time to be here with us. Your expertise and enthusiasm have made these episodes a great experience for me, and more importantly, a very engaging one for our listeners. So thanks again, Janice, and best wishes for continued success in this vital work.
Thank you very much for having me.
The Uncommon Sense podcast is presented by the CPA Education Foundation and funded by the Heshe CPA Knowledge Center. The Knowledge Center was created through a generous donation to the CPA Education Foundation by the late Brian Heshe. Brian was a distinguished Albertan, business leader, CPA, educator, and community builder. His generosity and commitment to education underpinned his good works across Alberta throughout his lifetime. The opinions expressed on this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the CPA Education Foundation. We would like to acknowledge that the CPA Education Foundation offices are situated on the traditional Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territories and Métis Nation homeland. The Foundation acknowledges that we reside on traditional and ancestral territories of many Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Their histories and culture influence our community to this day. The CPA Education Foundation is committed to helping build a province where Indigenous people and their voices and experiences are heard, valued, respected, and celebrated. Technical and recording services for this podcast provided by Wolf Willow Studios in Edmonton. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to like, subscribe, and tell your friends about us. If you have any comments on the podcast, write to us at cpaef@cpaalberta.ca. To learn more about the CPA Education Foundation and the Heshe CPA Knowledge Center, visit cpaalberta.ca/foundation. Thanks for listening.